The crack of the pistol shot was a sound that belonged to the wild, open country, not the buttoned-up confines of the dry, hollow bank. It splintered the morning quiet, sending a shockwave of panic through the queue of farmers and merchants. Jedediah Kane, who had been standing patiently sack of grain at his feet, reacted not with fear, but with a deep, weary instinct. He dropped low his body, moving with an economy of motion that spoke of a life lived on the edge of trouble, even if he now sought its center. 3 men, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas, stormed the room. One vaulted over the teller's counter, his boots thudding on the polished wood. Another stood guard at the door, a shotgun held loose but ready. The third, a wiry man with frantic eyes, brandished a Colt Peacemaker, waving it at the cowering townsfolk. On the floor, all of you. He shrieked, his voice tight with adrenaline. Jed was already down his hand, instinctively reaching for the holster he no longer wore. He'd given up that life, traded the gun for the plow, the bounty for the harvest. But the instincts remained sharp and unwelcome. He scanned the room, his gaze landing on a young mother clutching her small boy, both frozen with terror just a few feet away. The boy, no older than 5, let out a terrified whimper. The wiry gunman spun towards the sound, the barrel of his Colt swinging in their direction. "Shut that kid up." Time seemed to slow for Jed. He saw the tremble in the gunman's hand, the wildness in his eyes. It was a dangerous combination. Without a second thought, Jed moved. He didn't draw a weapon. He used his own body. In 2 long strides, he lunged, placing himself squarely between the pistol and the mother and child. He raised his hands, palms open, a gesture of placation that was at odds with the coiled readiness of his stance. "Easy now," he said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the shrill panic. "No need for that. We'll do as you say." The gunman hesitated, thrown by Jed's calm. The man at the counter was stuffing bills into a canvas sack. His movements hurried. "Just get the money and go." Jed continued, keeping his eyes locked on the gunman. The mother behind him scrambled backward, dragging her son towards the relative safety of a heavy oak desk. As she moved, a silver chain around her neck snagged on the corner of the desk and snapped. A small, heart-shaped locket clattered to the floorboards, spinning on its edge before falling flat. The glint of polished silver caught Jed's eye. And then, the world dissolved. For a fleeting, violent moment, the bank vanished. The scent of sawdust and fear was replaced by the acrid smell of smoke, thick and choking. The screams of the townsfolk faded, supplanted by a different scream, high, thin, and terrifyingly familiar. A girl's voice, his sister's. He saw not the polished floorboards, but charred wood, glowing embers winking in the darkness. He saw a face framed by fire eyes, wide with a terror he had failed to conquer. "Lila." "Hey, I'm talking to you." The gunman's shout ripped him back to the present. Jed blinked, the ghost of flames receding, leaving an ache behind his eyes. He was on one knee, his hand outstretched not towards the locket, but towards a memory. He pulled it back, clenching his fist. The man by the door grunted, "We got it, let's go." The 3 robbers backed out, their weapons still trained on the room. The moment the door slammed shut behind them, the bank erupted into a babble of relieved sobs and shaky chatter. Jed ignored it all. He rose slowly, his joints stiff, and walked to the oak desk. The mother was comforting her crying son, her own face pale with shock. Jed knelt and picked up the silver locket. It was warm from the frantic energy of the room. He held it in his calloused palm, its delicate form a stark contrast to the rugged landscape of his hand. "Thank you," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. "You saved us." Jed looked at her, but his eyes were distant, seeing something else entirely. He pressed the locket into her hand, his fingers brushing hers for only a second. "Hold on to what you love," he said, his voice thick with a sorrow that was a decade old. He turned and walked out of the bank, leaving the sack of grain behind. The cold winter air hit his face, but it couldn't touch the chill that had settled deep in his soul. The fire had taken his family, but it was the memory of failing to save his sister, of being the only one to walk out of the smoke that had been burning him alive ever since. The Kane Ranch was a sprawling expanse of land, carved out of the Montana wilderness, a place of stark beauty and profound loneliness. It sat in a valley cupped by jagged, snow-dusted peaks, the wind its only constant companion. Jed's life there was a ritual of hard labor and silence. He rose before the sun, his breath pluming in the frigid air of the bunkhouse, and worked until his muscles screamed and his mind was too numb to wander back to the flames. His only real companion was Gus, an old ranch hand whose face was a road map of wrinkles and whose hands were as gnarled as the ancient pines that dotted the property. Gus had worked for Jed's father and had stayed on after the fire, a silent, steady presence in the wreckage of Jed's life. "You look like you wrestled a ghost and lost," Gus observed a few days after the robbery, his voice raspy from a lifetime of cheap tobacco and dry air. He was mending a bridle in the relative warmth of the barn, the scent of leather and hay thick around them. Jed didn't look up from the horseshoe he was shaping over the forge, the rhythmic clang of his hammer on hot metal the only reply. Gus sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. "Heard what you did in town? Sheriff stopped by. Said you stood down one of them robbers without even blinking." He paused, squinting at Jed's rigid back. "That ain't something a simple rancher does, Jedediah." Jed plunged the glowing shoe into a barrel of water, the hiss of steam, a violent exhalation. "It's done," he said, his voice flat. He set the cooled metal aside and finally turned to face the old man. The grief that lived behind his eyes was starker than usual. The incident with the locket had scraped the scab off a wound that never truly healed. Survivor's guilt was a heavy coat he could never take off. He was respected in Dry Hollow, seen as a quiet, hard-working man who kept to himself. No one knew the inferno that raged inside him, the constant replayed failure of that night. The solitude of the ranch was both his sanctuary and his prison. He had inherited it all, the land, the cattle, the brand, but it felt less like a legacy and more like a tombstone for the family he'd lost. His isolation was interrupted later that week by the arrival of a pristine black buggy pulled by two perfectly matched geldings. Silas Blackwood stepped out, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed absurdly out of place against the ranch's rugged backdrop. Blackwood was a recent arrival in the territory, a man who oozed wealth and charisma. He had been buying up land with a relentless and unsettling fervor, and for months his sights had been set on the Kane Ranch. Kane Blackwood greeted his smile a flash of white that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "A fine morning." "It's morning," Jed grunted, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. Blackwood's gaze swept over the property, a proprietary air about him. "I've come to repeat my offer. In fact, I'm prepared to increase it. Substantially. A price far above what this land is worth." "It's not for sale," Jed said, the words a familiar refrain. Blackwood's smile tightened. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Every man has his price, Kane. And some land is cursed. Better to let it go. Start fresh." He paused, his eyes glinting with a strange intensity. "You know they say fire can cleanse a place, wipes the slate clean. A tragic thing what happened to your family here, but perhaps it was a cleansing of a sort." Jed's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The casual cruelty of the remark, cloaked in feigned sympathy, set his teeth on edge. There was something deeply unsettling about Blackwood, a predatory stillness beneath his polished exterior. "You should leave," Jed said, his voice low and dangerous. Blackwood held up his hands, in mock surrender. Merely an observation. But think on my offer, Cain. Sooner or later you'll realize I'm doing you a favor. He turned and strode back to his buggy, leaving Jed standing in a cloud of dust and quiet menace. Jed watched him go, a cold knot forming in his stomach. Blackwood didn't just want the land. He wanted something more. He spoke of fire and curses as if he knew them intimately. And for the first time, Jed felt a threat that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the past he so desperately wanted to bury. A week later, the memory of Blackwood's veiled threats still lingering in his mind, Jed rode into Dry Hollow for supplies. The town was a hive of activity, the muddy main street crowded with wagons and horses. He tied his mount outside the general store, the routine of the task, a small comfort. But as he turned, his eyes were drawn to a scene unfolding in the center of the square that made the blood in his veins run cold. There, tied to the public shaming post, was a young woman. She was barefoot in the half-frozen mud, her thin dress torn and offering little protection against the biting wind. Her face, when she briefly lifted it, was a canvas of bruises, but it was the scar that held his gaze. A vicious, puckered burn mark ran from her jaw to her cheekbone on the left side, pulling the skin tight and giving her an expression of perpetual sorrow. Her hands were bound behind the rough-hewn wood, and her shoulders slumped in utter defeat. A drunken, bloated man her father Jed gathered from his bellowing was trying to sell her. "Who'll take this useless thing off my hands?" He roared, spittle flying from his lips. "A strong back and she don't talk much. Killed her own sister in a fire, the clumsy fool, the pretty one died, and I was left with this." The crowd jeered. Cruel laughter and muttered insults filled the air. "Look at that face, she's cursed," someone shouted. Jed stood frozen, the sounds of the crowd fading into a dull roar in his ears. He wasn't just seeing a stranger's humiliation. He was seeing a reflection. He saw the mark of fire, a brand of survival that the world twisted into a mark of shame. He saw her trapped spirit bound to a post, just as he was bound to his own past, his own failure. The fragmented memory from the bank robbery surged forward, no longer a flicker, but a roaring blaze, Lila's face, the smoke, his own helplessness. "I couldn't save you." He had failed his sister. He had failed his family. He was the one who survived, the one left behind, to carry the weight of their ghosts. Watching this young woman, this fellow survivor, being torn apart by the world, an impulse fierce and undeniable seized him. It was not logic. It was not pity. It was a desperate, clawing need for redemption. A chance, however small, to do now what he could not do then, to save someone from the fire. He moved through the crowd, his steps deliberate, his presence silencing the mockery around him. He walked straight up to the drunken father, his expression unreadable stone. He reached into his coat, pulled out a heavy leather pouch, and threw it at the man's feet. The thud of the coins hitting the dirt was definitive. "She's mine now," Jed stated, his voice devoid of emotion. He ignored the father's greedy scrambling and the crowd's stunned silence. He walked to the post, and with his knife sliced through the ropes binding the young woman's wrists. She swayed, her head bowed, refusing to look at him. He could see the raw, chafed skin of her wrists. He shrugged off his heavy wool coat and draped it over her trembling shoulders. The coat enveloped her, a shield against the cold and the prying eyes. She flinched at the contact, but didn't pull away. He knelt in the mud before her, looking up not at her scar, but into the downcast eyes he could barely see. "Be my wife," he said, the words shocking even himself. They weren't a proposal of love or romance. They were a vow to her and to the ghost of his sister, a promise that this time he would not fail. This time he would pull someone from the ashes. The journey back to the ranch was a study in silence and tension. The wind whispered like a ghost through the skeletal pines that lined the trail, and the late afternoon sun cast long distorted shadows across the snow. Underfoot, the frozen ground crunched like broken glass, each step an intrusion into the profound quiet. Anna, swallowed by Jed's coat, walked beside his horse, her gaze fixed on the prints her bare feet left in the snow. She had refused to ride, as if accepting even that small comfort was a line she could not cross. Jed led the horse his own silence, a heavy cloak. He didn't know what to say. The words he'd spoken in the square. "Be my wife," hung in the air between them, an outlandish and impossible promise. He hadn't thought them through. They had erupted from a place of pure, unthinking instinct. Now, in the stark reality of the wilderness, he was left with the consequences, a terrified, traumatized young woman who looked at him as if he were just another cage. He tried once. The ranch isn't far now. She gave no sign she had heard him, her focus remaining on the ground. Her trauma was a wall, and his clumsy attempts to breach it felt like throwing stones. He saw how she flinched whenever his arm brushed against her, a small, involuntary recoil that mirrored his own flinching from the memories that haunted his sleep. He fell silent again, recognizing that his presence alone was an imposition. All he could offer was space and the quiet constancy of his stride next to hers. They arrived as dusk was bleeding purple and gray across the sky. Smoke curled from the chimney of the main house, a welcoming plume against the encroaching darkness. Gus was on the porch, a lantern in his hand, his weathered face etched with concern. He watched them approach, his eyes moving from Jed's grim expression to the small, huddled figure in the oversized coat. "Jedediah," Gus asked, his voice low. "Get some water," heated Gus, "and a blanket by the fire." Jed instructed, his tone leaving no room for questions. He helped Anna up the porch steps, his hand hovering near her back, but never touching. Inside, the warmth of the hearth was immediate. Anna stopped in the middle of the room, looking lost and small, a ship wrecked on an unfamiliar shore. Jed gestured toward a chair near the fire. "Sit, please." She remained standing, her body rigid. Gus entered with a steaming basin of water and a clean cloth, setting them on the floor. He glanced from Anna's bruised feet to Jed's face, his expression a mixture of confusion and pity. Later, after Anna had silently, cautiously tended to her feet and was now staring into the flames, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, Gus pulled Jed aside into the cold of the adjoining storeroom. "What in God's name is this?" Gus demanded in a harsh whisper. "Who is she?" "Her name is Anna," Jed said, his voice tired. I bought her." Gus stared at him, his mouth agape. "You bought her like a sack of feed. Have you lost your mind?" "Her father was selling her in the square. For drink money." The anger in Gus's eyes softened into a deep, troubled sadness. He ran a hand over his bald head. "Lord, have mercy. The poor thing. But what are you going to do with her, Jed? A woman ain't a stray calf you can just put in a pen. You can't fix her broken life by bringing it into your own." The question hit Jed with the force of a physical blow, because it was the same question screaming in his own mind. He had acted on impulse, on a desperate need to quiet the ghosts of his past. He had seen a fire and had run toward it, but he had no idea how to put it out. "I don't know," Jed admitted, the words tasting like ash. "I just knew I couldn't leave her there." Gus looked past him through the open door at the girl sitting by the fire. She hadn't moved a muscle, her stillness so profound it was almost unnerving. "Well," Gus sighed, "you've done it now. You've brought another ghost into this house. Let's just pray she doesn't haunt you worse than the ones already here." Weeks turned into a month. The snows deepened, isolating the ranch from the rest of the world. Within this quiet bubble, a fragile routine began to form. Anna remained mostly nonverbal, her voice a rare and startling sound, like a bird taking flight in a silent room. But she began to heal in small, almost imperceptible ways. Jed would watch her from a distance, seeing life return to her in increments. He found her one morning in the barn, her hand resting on the neck of the chestnut mare who had fallen ill. Anna was whispering to the animal, her voice a soft, melodic hum. Her touch was gentle, her presence calming, and by the next day, the mare was standing, her fever broken. Jed had never seen such a gentle touch. It was as if she poured all the words she couldn't speak into her hands. He started leaving small tokens for her to find a smooth river stone on the windowsill, a sprig of winter pine on her pillow. He never acknowledged them, and neither did she, but they were a quiet conversation in a house of silence. The first time she spoke a full sentence to him, it was over supper. He had clumsily patched a tear in his shirt, the stitches large and uneven. She looked at the botched repair, a flicker of something not quite a smile, but a softening in her eyes. "My mother taught me how to sew," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The next morning, he found the shirt neatly mended on his chair, the stitches perfect and nearly invisible. Their fragile peace was shattered by the return of Silas Blackwood. He rode up to the ranch unannounced, his presence an immediate violation of the sanctuary Jed had tried to build. He dismounted his expensive leather boots, sinking into the mud, and his eyes immediately found Anna, who was hanging laundry on a line near the house. She froze, clutching a wet sheet to her chest like a shield. Cain Blackwood set his smile, as polished and predatory as ever. He let his gaze linger on Anna, sweeping over her from head to foot, before settling with deliberate cruelty on the scar on her face. A slow, knowing smirk spread across his lips. "It seems you have a taste for damaged things, Cain." "So do I." Anna flinched as if struck. A wave of terror washed over her face, the old haunted look returning to her eyes. Jed stepped between them, his body a physical barrier. A protective fire, hot and fierce, ignited in his chest. "You're not welcome here, Blackwood." Blackwood chuckled, undeterred. "I am simply making a friendly visit, and another offer for this cheerless piece of property." His eyes flicked back to Anna. "Perhaps I should be making my offers to the lady of the house now. I'm sure she could be persuaded." "Get off my land." Jed growled, his hand moving instinctively to his side. "As you wish," Blackwood said, raising his hands in his customary gesture of mock surrender. But as he turned to leave, his demeanor shifted from polite to openly threatening. "A word of advice, Cain. You can't save them all. Sometimes the best thing for a wounded animal is to put it out of its misery." The encounter left Anna deeply shaken. That night she barely touched her food, her hands trembling. Jed watched her, his heart aching with a fury he hadn't felt in years. Blackwood hadn't just threatened him. He had targeted Anna, deliberately twisting the knife in her deepest wound. The incident spurred Jed to action. The next day, he rode into Dry Hollow and paid a visit to Sheriff Miller, a man he trusted. He asked about Blackwood, about his relentless campaign to buy up land in the valley. "It's strange," Jed Miller said, leaning back in his chair, his brow furrowed in thought. "He's not just buying random parcels. Every property he's acquired, including the ones he's pressuring you for, belonged to a family on the old town council. The one from about 15 years back." Jed felt a prickle of unease. "What about it?" "You remember the big land dispute before your time, really, but your father was at the center of it. Him against that Abernathy family. They claimed your father forged the deed to this valley." The sheriff sighed. The council held a hearing. They sided with your father, ruled his claim was legitimate. The Abernathys were furious. They packed up and left town, said they were headed for Oregon, vanished off the face of the earth. Jed listened, a cold dread seeping into his bones. So Blackwood is buying land from the men who ruled in my father's favor. Every last one, Miller confirmed. It's like he's collecting pieces on a chessboard. I just can't figure out what game he's playing. Jed rode home, the sheriff's words echoing in his mind. Cursed land. Fire can cleanse a place. Blackwood's cryptic comments suddenly felt less like strange ramblings and more like pieces of a puzzle he was terrified to solve. The threat was no longer just about property. It was personal. It was rooted in the past, in his father's legacy, and it was closing in on them like a winter storm. The weight of the sheriff's words pressed down on Jed. That night, unable to sleep, he found himself in the small, dusty attic, searching for something he couldn't name. He sifted through his father's old possessions, ledgers, tools, worn clothes that still held the faint scent of wood smoke and earth. In the bottom of a heavy cedar chest, beneath a stack of yellowed maps, his fingers brushed against the brittle, warped leather of a book. It was his father's journal. The edges were blackened, the cover scorched in one corner, one of the few things that had been salvaged from the embers of the old farmhouse. He took it downstairs, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. By the flickering light of an oil lamp, with Anna and Gus asleep and the house shrouded in silence, he opened it. His father's handwriting was strong and clear at the beginning, but as he turned the pages, the entries grew more troubled, the ink occasionally smudged, as if by a tear or a shaken hand. He found the entries from the time of the land dispute. His father wrote of the Abernethys, with a complex mix of resentment and something that felt disturbingly like guilt. Mistal, they will not see reason. One entry read, Abernethy looks at me with such hatred. He believes this valley is his by divine right. The council will side with me, the deeds are clear, but I fear this victory will cost more than the land is worth. Jed flipped forward, his breath catching in his throat, when he found the final entry dated just a few weeks after the hearing. The handwriting was nearly illegible, a frantic scrawl across the page. God forgive me. Word came from the past this morning. A fire. The Abernethy homestead burned to the ground 2 nights ago. They say the whole family was inside. They say it was a lantern fire, an accident. But Abernethy was a careful man. I saw him in town the day of the hearing. He looked at me and said, You will reap what you sow, Cain. Your whole family will burn in it. Was it a threat or a prophecy? I feel their ghosts on the wind. This land feels tainted by their blood. I have won the valley, but I fear I have damned my soul. Jed stared at the words, the room seeming to tilt around him. Blackwood's obsession, his talk of curses and cleansing fire, it all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This wasn't about land. It was about revenge. The next morning, a hard frost clinging to the windows, Jed rode back into town like a man possessed. He found Sheriff Miller at his desk, nursing a cup of coffee. The Abernethys, Jed said, his voice raw. Tell me about them. Miller raised an eyebrow at Jed's intensity. Not much to tell. John Abernethy, his wife, and their boy Silas. A quiet family kept to themselves. The fire was ruled an accident. Why the sudden interest? Silas, Jed repeated the name, feeling like poison on his tongue. How old was he? Just a boy, 10, maybe 12. Jed leaned forward, his hands flat on the sheriff's desk. I need you to send a telegraph to the U.S. Marshal in Cheyenne. I need to know everything you can find on a man named Silas Blackwood. Where he came from, how he made his money. 3 days later, the reply came. Miller summoned Jed to his office, his face grim. He slid the telegraph message across the desk. Jed read the clipped official words, and the last piece of the puzzle fell into place. Silas Blackwood had no history before 5 years ago, when he had appeared in Cheyenne with a fortune made from a mysterious gold strike. There was no record of his birth, no family. He was a ghost. But the marshal, prompted by Miller's query about the Abernathy fire, had included a final chilling detail. The Army surgeon who had examined the remains at the Abernathy homestead had noted that the body of the boy Silas was never definitively recovered from the ashes. "It's him," Jed whispered the words barely audible. "Blackwood is Silas Abernathy." The sheriff nodded slowly. The sole survivor come back to settle a score. The conflict was no longer a simple fight for property against a greedy land baron. It was a generational feud born from a fire 15 years ago. Jed was facing a man on a lifelong quest for vengeance, a man who believed Jed's father was responsible for the destruction of his entire world. And Jed Kane, along with everyone and everything he held dear, was standing squarely in the path of that man's righteous burning rage. With his identity all but revealed, Silas Abernathy, he would always be Blackwood to the world. But in Jed's mind, he was now the ghost of that long-ago fire, abandoned all pretense of civility. The polite threats gave way to open aggression. The first attack was not with guns, but with water. One morning, the creek that fed Jed's ranch, their lifeblood in the arid landscape, slowed to a trickle. Jed and Gus rode upstream to find a crudely constructed dam, diverting the entire flow onto Blackwood's newly acquired neighboring property. It was a clear act of war, a slow strangulation of their livelihood. Next came the whispers. Blackwood hired men not to fight, but to spread poison. They loitered in the Dry Hollow saloon, spinning vicious rumors that took root in the town's imagination. They spoke of Anna, the scarred girl Jed kept hidden away. They called her a witch, claiming the burn on her face was the devil's mark. They insinuated she had cursed the Kane land, twisting her tragic past into a tale of dark magic. They called her Jed's scarred whore, a phrase that made Jed's blood run hot with a murderous rage. Soon, the town that had once respected Jed's quiet dignity now looked at him with suspicion and fear. Old friends averted their eyes in the street. The general store owner became curt and cold. The community, once a source of distant but steady support, had turned against them, isolating them on their ranch as surely as the winter snows. The siege took its toll, especially on Anna. She grew quieter, more withdrawn, and the fragile progress she had made seeming to shatter. She saw the sideways glances in town, heard the muttered insults. She began to believe the rumors herself. She was a curse. She had brought this danger, this hatred down upon the one man who had shown her kindness. One evening, Jed found her by the window, staring out at the darkening landscape, her shoulders slumped in defeat. A small bundle of her few belongings sat on the floor beside her. "I have to leave," she said, her voice hollow. "He's doing this because of me. The things they're saying, they're right. I bring ruin wherever I go." Jed's heart broke. He saw the same self-loathing that had crippled him for years reflected in her eyes. He crossed the room and gently took her hands, turning her to face him. "No," he said, his voice fierce with conviction. "You are not a curse. You are the reason I'm standing firm. Before you came, this was just land, a place to work until I was too tired to remember. Now it's a home. Our home. I'm not fighting for the dirt, Anna. I'm fighting for you. For us." He saw the conflict in her eyes, the desperate want to believe him, warring with a lifetime of being told she was worthless. He knew he had to give her more than just reassurance. He had to give her the truth. "There are things you don't know about me," he said softly, leading her to the chairs by the hearth. "About this land, about fire." And so he told her everything. He told her about the Abernathys, about his father's guilt-ridden journal, about his realization that Blackwood was the surviving son consumed by a quest for revenge. Then, his voice cracking with a pain that was still raw, he told her about the fire that had claimed his own family. He spoke of the smoke, the heat, the chaos. He confessed his deepest shame, how he, a boy of 16, had gotten out while his parents and his younger sister Lila had been trapped. "I couldn't get to her," he whispered, the words tearing from his throat. I could hear her calling my name, but the roof collapsed. I failed her. I failed them all. For 10 years I've been living in the shadow of that failure. When I saw you in the square, marked by fire, a survivor, I saw a chance to do it right, to save someone. It wasn't pity, Anna. It was redemption. As he spoke, something shifted in Anna's expression. The fear was replaced by a profound, heart-wrenching empathy. When he finished, she reached out, and for the first time initiated a touch, her slender fingers gently tracing the lines of his face. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but they were not for herself. My sister's name was Elsie. She said, her voice gaining a strength he had never heard before. She was 8. I was trying to cook to be helpful, and the grease caught fire. I ran. I was so scared. I just ran outside. And I left her in there. Her confession came out in a ragged sob. My father was right. I killed her. I'm the one who should have died. No, Jed said, his voice thick. He covered her hand with his own. You were a child, just like I was a boy. We survived. That's not a sin. In the warm glow of the firelight, their shared confessions hung in the air. Not as burdens, but as bridges. They were two souls branded by the same tragedy, each believing they were uniquely damned. In revealing their deepest scars to one another, they found not judgment, but understanding. Their bond, forged in a transaction of desperation, was now tempered in the fires of shared trauma, becoming something stronger and more real than either of them could have imagined. They were no longer just a rancher and the girl he'd saved. They were Jed and Anna, and they would face the coming storm together. The dust storm rolled in from the west, a monstrous roiling wall of brown that swallowed the sky. The wind, which had been a whisper all day, rose to a mournful howl, rattling the windows and tearing at the shingles of the barn. It was the perfect cover. Jed knew with a certainty that settled like ice in his gut that Blackwood was coming. He'd sent Gus into town hours earlier before the storm hit with a simple instruction: if he wasn't back by sunrise, ride for the sheriff and tell him the war had come to the Kane Ranch. It was a desperate gamble, but it was their only one. Now, as darkness fell and the world outside was reduced to a maelstrom of wind and grit, Jed, Anna, and an old shotgun-wielding Gus were trapped. They took refuge in the main barn, its thick timber walls offering the best defense. Lanterns swung wildly from the rafters, casting long, dancing shadows that turned familiar shapes into lurking monsters. The air was thick with the smell of hay animals and fear. "He'll try the main doors first," Jed said, his voice tight as he checked the action on his rifle. "Gus, you and Anna take the loft. You'll have a clear line of sight." Anna, her face pale but her eyes resolute, clutched the pistol Jed had given her. She had spent weeks practicing her hands, now steady her aim true. She was no longer a victim waiting to be rescued. The first assault came with a splintering crash as one of Blackwood's men threw himself against a side door. A shot from Gus's shotgun from the loft above sent him screaming back into the storm. Gunfire erupted from all sides, bullets thudding into the barn walls, kicking up splinters. The chaos was deafening: the howl of the wind, the crack of rifles, the panicked lowing of the cattle in their stalls. Jed moved with deadly efficiency, using hay bales for cover firing, reloading, and moving again. He was not a gunslinger, but he was a survivor, and he would protect his home. The fight raged, a desperate close-quarters battle fought in swirling dust and flickering light. One of Blackwood's men managed to breach a window, only to be met by a shot from Anna's pistol. He dropped to the hay-strewn floor, his surprised eyes staring up at the girl in the loft. Then, during a brief, eerie lull in the fighting, a new voice cut through the wind. "Kane, it's me you want, face me." It was Blackwood. Jed saw him then, a silhouette in the main doorway, stepping calmly into the barn, as if walking into a parlor. His men held back, creating a deadly arena in the center of the floor. Blackwood's face was a mask of twisted grief, his charismatic veneer stripped away to reveal the raw, burning hatred beneath. "This is for my father," he hissed, taking a step forward. "For my mother. For the life your father stole from me when he paid a drifter to set our home ablaze." Jed raised his rifle, the accusation hitting him like a physical blow. "My father did no such thing." Liar, Blackwood screamed, his voice cracking. "He wanted this valley, and he burned my family to get it. I lost everything in that fire. Everything." He advanced on Jed, his own pistol raised, his eyes wild with a pain that was 15 years old. "And I wanted to return the favor. To burn his legacy to the ground, to make you feel the way I felt. I paid a man to set a fire to destroy the old farmhouse you were rebuilding, to wipe the Kane name from this valley for good." He was close now, the two of them circling each other in the lantern light. Blackwood's face contorted, the rage giving way to a terrible, agonized confession. "But I got the night wrong," he snarled, tears mixing with the dust on his cheeks. "Your family. They weren't supposed to be home. They were supposed to be in town. It was an accident." The world stopped. The wind, the dust, the fear, it all receded into a silent hum. The man who had been hunting him, tormenting him, was the same man who had murdered his family. The fire, the central defining tragedy of Jed's life, was not a random act of fate. It was a mistake, an act of vengeance aimed at an empty house that had instead claimed his entire world. Blackwood's lifelong vendetta wasn't just for his own family. It was a desperate, monstrous attempt to justify the accidental horror he himself had committed. He needed Jed to be a villain, to make sense of his own transformation into a monster. An ocean of rage, cold and absolute, washed over Jed. He saw Lila's face in the flames. He heard her scream. He had him. The man who had destroyed his life was standing 10 feet away. He leveled his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. Blackwood stared back, a strange look of relief on his face, as if welcoming the end. "Yet no." Anna's voice, clear and sharp, cut through the chaos from the loft above. "Don't become him." Her words struck him with more force than a bullet. He looked from Blackwood's broken face to hers, pleading with him from the shadows. To kill him now would not be justice. It would be revenge. It would be an act born of the same fire that had forged Silas Abernathy into this creature of hate. It would make them the same. In that moment of agonizing choice, as his soul hung in the balance, a new sound pierced the storm, the sharp blast of a whistle. Red and blue lights flashed outside the barn, cutting through the thick dust. The pounding of hooves and the shouts of men surrounded them. "This is Sheriff Miller. Drop your weapons. You're surrounded." Gus's signal had worked. The law had arrived. Blackwood's face crumpled, not in fear, but in utter defeat. He was not defeated by a bullet, but by the one thing he had abandoned long ago: justice. He slowly lowered his pistol, the fight draining out of him, leaving only the hollowed-out shell of a grief-stricken boy. The dust began to settle both outside and in the chaotic aftermath, as Sheriff Miller's deputies rounded up Blackwood's men and led a catatonic Silas away in chains. The world of the barn shrank to the small space where Jed and Anna stood. He had a gash on his forehead, and his arm throbbed from a bullet graze, but he felt none of it. He only felt the steady pressure of Anna's hand on his back. She tended to his wounds with a quiet competence, her touch gentle, her presence a calming anchor in the sea of turmoil. When the barn was empty of all but the three of them, they stepped outside. The wind had died down, leaving behind a sky washed clean and studded with stars. The air was cool and crisp. Together, they surveyed the damage. The barn was riddled with bullet holes. The porch rail splintered, the creek dammed. Their home was wounded, but it was still standing. And for the first time, they were facing the wreckage together. Later, Sheriff Miller returned. He confessed to everything, Jed, he said, his voice heavy with weariness. The dam, the rumors, everything, including the fire that killed your family. He seemed relieved, like he'd been carrying it for a lifetime and was glad to finally set it down. Over the next few days, the truth of Blackwood's story spread through Dry Hollow like a slow-moving river. The whispers against Jed and Anna died out, replaced by a current of shame and regret. One by one, then, in small groups, the townspeople began to make the journey out to the Kane Ranch. They came with hammers and lumber, with baskets of food, and quiet, heartfelt apologies. They came to help rebuild not just the barn, but the trust that had been broken. The community, in its own quiet way, was seeking redemption. One evening, after the last of the helpers had gone for the day, Jed and Anna sat on the newly repaired porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in hues of orange and purple. The silence between them was no longer tense or fragile, but comfortable and deep. "The scar on your face," Jed said softly, not looking at it, but at her. "I used to think it was a reminder of what you'd survived. But it's more than that, isn't it? It's a part of the story that brought you here. To me." Anna reached up and touched the puckered skin, her own gesture now free of its old shame. "And the ghosts of your fire," she replied, her voice gentle. "They're what made you a man who would stop for a girl tied to a post. Our scars, they're like a map that led us to each other." There was no magic cure for the pain of their pasts. The ghosts would likely always be there, whispering in the quiet moments. But sitting there together, they made a silent choice not to be defined by the fires they had endured, but by the home they were building from the ashes. They chose to move forward, to let the map of their scars lead them not to a place of sorrow, but to a future they would create together. Months passed. Spring arrived, breathing new life into the valley. The scorched earth of the past gave way to a carpet of green, and the creek, freed from Blackwood's dam, once again ran clear and strong. The ranch recovered its wounds, slowly healing under the warm sun, and life settled into a new, peaceful rhythm. Under the sprawling branches of the old oak tree that stood sentinel behind the house, Jed and Anna were married. It was a small ceremony with only Gus and Sheriff Miller as witnesses, but the vows they exchanged held the weight and permanence of the mountains that surrounded them. Sometime later, on a quiet afternoon, Jed retrieved a small cloth-wrapped object from his dresser. He unwrapped it to reveal the charred, heart-shaped silver locket that had fallen to the floor of the bank all those months ago. He had gone back for it, this small, twisted piece of silver that had triggered so much pain and ultimately so much healing. For years he had seen it as a token of his guilt, a symbol of the sister he failed to save. Now it felt different. He took Anna's hand, and together they walked to a newly tilled patch of land near the house. In the rich, dark earth, they planted a small sapling, a young oak that would one day grow as mighty as its parent. Before covering the roots, Jed knelt and placed the locket in the soil. He and Anna pushed the earth back into place, together, their hands brushing. It was not an act of forgetting. It was an act of acceptance. They were letting the pain of their past become the foundation for new life, something that would nourish the roots of their future and help it grow strong. As they stood back to admire their work, the tiny tree, a fragile promise against the vast sky. Anna turned to him. She took his hand and placed it gently on her stomach. A slow, wondrous smile spread across Jed's face as understanding dawned. It was a final, beautiful surprise, a quiet announcement that their story was not merely about survival. It was about the defiant, unyielding promise of a future built on love, forgiveness, and healing. The camera of memory pulled back, showing the two of them hand in hand, standing beside the tiny sapling, three symbols of new beginnings, thriving on a land that was once thought cursed, a testament to the fact that even after the most devastating fire, life finds a way to grow again.